Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Dharma Pranam Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Please accept our obeisances. All the
Sorry, I'm a little late.
It's okay, Prabhu. Prabhu, we are very, very grateful to you, Prabhuji, for your valuable time and giving your association to all of us. So we just introduce you, Prabhuji, to start the session, Prabhuji.
Okay.
Thank you, Prabhu. Hare Krishna. So we are very, very fortunate once again to have with us His Grace Mukunda Prabhu. And we are very blessed to have Prabhu's association. And he has been very, very kind enough to give his associations very frequently here in Kanyadesh. In last 1 week, we had almost 4 times Prabhuji association. We had a wonderful festival, Nasam Chaturasi, and then last week also we got Prabhuji association. And again today. So we are very, very blessed and very, very grateful to Prabhuji for giving his associations and his valuable time to all of us. So the devotee who are not familiar with Prabhuji, Prabhuji is disciple of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. And they're in this movement for more than 4 decades. And he's very, very well known for his wonderful melodious kirtan, especially in the style of the Bengali kirtan, which he has learned the classical kirtan. And apart from that, he's serving as a Sanskrit and English translator and editor for the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust. And he's very well known for his scholarly studying of Srila Prabhupada books and the Shastric studies. And he's also an advisor, counselor, and also a scholar of Sanskrit, Hindi, and other Indic languages. And he served as a member of Shastric Advisory Council to the ISKCON GBC, Governing Body Commission. And he has traveled widely, lecturing for many years on Vedic literature, such as Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, other Prabhupada books, and staying in Sridham, Vrindavan, enlightening so many souls like us. So let's welcome Prabhuji by chanting one time Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna,
Hare Hare,
Hare Ram,
Ram Hare Ram, Ram
Hare
Hare Hare.
His Grace Mukunda Prabhu ki Jai, Shri Prabhupada ki
Jai.
Dandavats, Vaishnavas, all glories to Shri Prabhupada. Thank you very much for your kind invitation and a warm welcome. We will, without any further ado, continue to the Srimad Bhagavatam. First canto, chapter 5, texts number 1 through 10. Very important topic. So we'll begin as always with Mangalacharana. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudirayet Nashta Praishwa Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Muktir Bhavati Naishtiki Krishna Swadhamo Bhagate Dhanamagyanadevisaha Kalau Nashtadrishamesha Uranarko Tunoditaha. Do we need a translation for this class? I don't recall.
Prabhu, actually we have a mixed crowd, Prabhu, but since time is less, Prabhuji, so we'll hear in English and we'll make some points and we'll brief them afterwards.
Okay, so as I said, we're beginning with Srimad Bhagavatam text number 1 of the first canto, 5th chapter. Sutta uvacha atatam sukham asina upasinam prahatshavaha devarshi praha viprashim dina pane smayan niva. Sutta Goswami said, the sage among the gods nodded, comfortably seated and apparently smiling, addressed the rishi amongst the brahmanas, Vedavyas. Report. Narad was smiling because he well knew the great sage Vyas and the cause of his disappointment. As he will explain gradually, Vyasadev's disappointment was due to insufficiency in presenting the science of devotional service. Narad knew the defect, and it was confirmed by the position of Vyas. Om Jnana Timarantasya Jnana Janashalakaya Chakshur Militamena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langhayate Girim Yat Kripatamaham Vande Shri Gurum Dinataranam Madgavir Vigopala Svipuryat Kripaya Yadi Tadaivasam Payaha Pitwa Trishni Statvyajanaha. To set the context, Vyasadeva is despondent because in spite of having compiled all the Vedic literatures, he doesn't quite feel fully satisfied and he's not sure why. So he's inquiring from Narad Muni, who will explain everything very clearly. We will also make an attempt to explain things according to what we have heard from all of our Guru Janas. So in the beginning, on this particular verse, first text, Sridhar Swami gives his summary of the whole chapter. Panchame Sarva Dharme Pyo Harikirtana Gauravam Vyasa Chitta Prasadaya Naradeno Padishyate. In this fifth chapter, in order to satisfy the mind of Vyas, Narad instructs to have more respect for Harikirtan than all the other dharmas. We'll hear more about this. Jiva Goswami has not commented. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he says that this chapter shows the uselessness of karma and gyan, and Narad teaches Vyas about bhakti, which is the chief component of which is kirtan. Welcoming his guest, Vyas was worshipping him by offering asan, arghya, padya, and other items. These are rituals that are not very often performed any longer, but in deity worship, we do all of these things because it's formal. So there was a smile, slight smile on Narad Muni's lips, smayaniva, as if smiling. It reminds us of the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita. After Krishna hears Arjuna's despondency, he's also smiling, slightly. So, according to Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, this smile shows that Narad knows everything. He's internally pleased with Vyas. It was not possible for him to hide his smile by pretending something else because of the interesting questions he would pose. In other words, sometimes when we're preaching, someone asks you a question and it's delightful because there are so many different ways to answer the question that you have to decide which one would be more appropriate for this particular individual, for this particular context, and for this particular circumstance. So that's about all that's said about the first verse. Second verse, we have 10 after all, so we'll go quickly. Naradu vacha parasharya mahabhaga bhavatah kachid atmana Paritushyati Sharira Atma Manasa Eva Va. Addressing Vyasadeva, the son of Parashar, Narad inquired, are you satisfied by identifying with the body or the mind as objects of self-realization? Report. This was a hint by Narad to Vyasadeva regarding the cause of his despondency. Vyasadeva, as the descendant of Parashar, a greatly powerful sage, had the privilege of having a great parentage, which should not have given Vyasadeva cause for despondency. Being a great son of a great father, he should not have identified the self with the body or the mind. Now, this is interesting point. Prabhupada continues, ordinary men with a poor fund of knowledge can identify the body as self or the mind as the self. But Vyasadeva should not have done so. It's a very, very interesting point, couple of points here in Srila Prabhupada's purport. First of all, it is a privilege to have great parentage. He's called Padacharya here to indicate, not it is hinting to him that, look, you are the son of Parashar. It doesn't behoove you to behave like this. In very much the same way that he told Arjuna, again, in Bhagavad Gita. And we see this throughout the Shastras. It's an appeal, as it were, to false ego. But that has some value to it. Why? We get an answer, one answer, from, of all people, William Shakespeare. In William Shakespeare's Sonnet 94, he says, there's an oft-quoted line from that poem. He says, "The sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds." In other words, if a man is great, or if a woman is great, and somehow or other they do some abominable thing, then that is a much worse, it is much more noticeable in such a person than it is in a common person, ordinary person. Srila Prabhupada gives another analogy to explain this. It's like a spot of black ink on a white cloth. It's much more noticeable than a spot of black ink on a blue cloth, or on a black cloth for that matter, dark. So this is the idea. Those who are initiated by a bona fide spiritual master, everyone actually who has joined the International Society for Krishna Consciousness and taken up the process of Krishna consciousness, has to be mindful of the fact that we have the reputation of this entire society to uphold, each one of us. And we have the reputation of our spiritual master to uphold. People will look at us and say, you know, we like your guru, but we're not sure about you. That is not very good. So that is what Narad Muni is hinting at here by calling Vyasadeva Paracharya. He's just reminding him, and Mahabhaga, you're a very fortunate person to have Paracharya as your father. Now, what about you? What are you doing? What are you saying? So, Srila Prabhupada then continues his purport. I mean to say, he concludes his purport. One cannot be cheerful by nature unless one is factually seated in self-realization, which is transcendental to the material body and mind. I'm going to read that again because it's so deep with meaning. One cannot be cheerful by nature unless one is factually seated in self-realization, which is transcendental to the material body and mind. So it's not an easy thing to be Krishna conscious. And according to this sentence, it's not even necessarily an easy thing to be transcendental. It's not easy to realize, to attain self-realization. We say the beginning of Krishna consciousness is very simple. You have to realize, Aham Brahmasmi, I am spirit, not matter. That is very simple idea. Anyone can understand the idea, but to live that idea, that is another matter, because we're all heavily conditioned souls. We're crushed, as it were, by the weight of our karma. And as Arjuna tells us in Bhagavad Gita, we're impelled to do things that we know are wrong, even if we don't really want to do them. We're so much at the beck and call of the material energy that we're almost helpless. Bhaktivedanta Thakur says it's like we're being tossed about on the waves of the ocean. So this is what it means to be a conditioned soul. One planet changes, which in time they all do, and your whole personality can change. Your whole perception of spiritual life can change. I've seen this happen. It's frightening, actually. So let's read this again. One cannot be cheerful by nature unless one is factually seated in self-realization, which is transcendental to the material body and mind. Now, cheerful. We all like to be cheerful, but we're not always cheerful. What about that? Brahma bhuta prasannatma na shochati na kangshati samastarveshu bhuteshu madbhaktim labhate param. Later on, Prabhupada talks about this more, so I won't dilate. But the idea is that when we uncover the soul, when we strip away all the dross, all the unneeded things that we're so absorbed in and identified with now, then we become cheerful, because that is our natural identity and nature. It is our nature, intrinsic nature, I need to say. Now, on this point, Srila Prabhupada makes a very striking comment in his purport to Srimad Bhagavatam, 1st Canto, Chapter 3, Text 44. We've already read this if we're going sequentially in this series. Prabhupada writes, listen carefully, quote, simple hearing is not all. One must realize the text with proper attention. The word nivishta means that Suta Goswami drank the juice of Bhagavatam through his ears. That is the real process of receiving Bhagavatam. One should hear with rapt attention from the real person, and then he can at once realize the presence of Lord Krishna in every page. Now, here's the part that is relevant, especially to what we're discussing. He continues. The secret of knowing Bhagavatam is mentioned here. No one can give rapt attention who is not pure in mind. No one can be pure in mind who is not pure in action. No one can be pure in action who is not pure in eating, sleeping, fearing, and mating. That is again from Srila Prabhupada's purport to Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Text 3, Chapter 40, verse 34. It amplifies an idea that has already been heard even before Vyasadeva wrote the Srimad Bhagavatam. In the Chandogya Upanishad of Book 7, text number 26, we find the same idea, or at least a similar idea. Ahara shuddhau sattva shuddhihi. Sattva shuddhau trava smritihi. Smriti lambhe sarva grantinam vipramokshaha. When one's food is pure, one's being becomes pure. Sattva means your existence. When one's being is pure, one's memory becomes strong. And when one acquires memory, all the knots are cut away. Srila Prabhupada actually quotes this passage from Chandogya Upanishad in his purport to Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, text 11. So it's worth repeating that as well. He writes, quote, by performance of yajnas, all activities become purified, as it is stated in the Vedas. Ahara shuddhau sattva shuddhihi, sattva shuddhau dhruva smritihi, smriti lambhe sarva grantinam vipramokshaha. By performance of yajna, one's eatables become sanctified, and by eating sanctified foodstuffs, one's very existence becomes purified. By the purification of existence, finer tissues in the memory become sanctified. And when memory is sanctified, one can think of the path of liberation. And all these combined together lead to Krishna consciousness, the great necessity of present day society, end quote. What a powerful statement, a whole chain of statements actually that Srila Prabhupada has given us in regards to this principle that is mentioned here. So we don't really have so much time to focus on that, unfortunately, but it kind of gives us, this is the thing to take home about this. It gives us some sense of the connection between what we are supposed to do and what we are supposed to become. All the rules and regulations of the Shastras, especially the Smritis, what time you wake up, what you eat, how you dress, who you associate with, for how long, in what context, what kind of work you do, everything that we do in our mundane affairs has an impact on our Krishna consciousness. We need to know this. Sangat sanjayate kama. Krishna warns Arjuna. Your desires are the product of your associations. So all the vidhis and all the nishedhas of the Shastras, the Dharma Smritis in particular, they're meant to purify our existence in this way so that we can finally hear what Srila Prabhupada is saying. We are hearing every day already, but somehow or other it doesn't seem to get in, or it doesn't sit here in the heart. So there's a problem. And that problem is that our existence has not been purified. We're overwhelmed by what Krishna calls Dvandva Moha in chapter 7, text 28 of Bhagavad Gita. The bewilderment of dualities in material existence. When we are in the bodily concept of life, Krishna consciousness becomes difficult. We've all experienced that. Okay, so I'm going to have to set that topic aside. It's suitable for an entire seminar, actually, but we have to move on because we've got more verses to cover here. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, Sharira Atma in this verse means identifying oneself with the body. Is this self satisfied with the body? Is the self identified with the mind and satisfied with the mind? Kachit means or not. Addressing Vyasa as the most fortunate son of Parashar, Nada suggests that if Vyasa possesses such powerful ancestry, how could he lament? And with this, he says, Narad Muni implies some dissatisfaction with Vyasa, but he doesn't say it. He's a very expert teacher. Sometimes the spiritual master will not always tell us when he's dissatisfied. Or sometimes he will. It depends. So, text number 3. Jiknyasitam susampannam apite maharadhutam kritavan bharatam yastvam sarvartha paripranyatam. No doubt your inquiries were full and your studies also well fulfilled, since you have prepared a great, wonderful work, Mahabharata, which is full of all kinds of Vedic sequences, elaborately explained. Purport. You may be wondering what a Vedic sequence is. I was when I read this. The despondency of Vyasadeva was certainly not due to his lack of sufficient knowledge, because as a student, he had fully inquired about the Vedic literatures, as a result of which Mahabharata is compiled with a full explanation of the Vedas. That's what Prabhupada means, evidently, by the word sequences. Sridhar Swami also makes this a little bit clear in his commentary. Sarvayat artayar dharmadiki paripranhitam paripurnam. This is the nature of Mahabharata. It has all the meanings regarding things dharmic very nicely explained. Dharma is the consummate compendium of all things Shreyas. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary on this verse is probably the most simple and to the point. You cannot say that the source of your dissatisfaction is lack of scriptural knowledge because you wrote the Mahabharata, period. End of quote. So that's Vishwanath Chakravarti's comment. Text number 4. Jiknyasitam adhitam cha brahma yattat sanatanam tathapi shochat yatmanam akritartha eva prabho. Nicely put. You have fully delineated the subject of impersonal Brahman as well as the knowledge derived therefrom. Why should you be despondent in spite of all this, thinking that you are undone, my dear Prabhu? What does it mean to be undone? Akritartha. In other words, unsuccessful, or maybe incomplete, you can say. Prabhupada clarifies in the purport. The Vedanta Sutra or Brahma Sutra compiled by Sri Vyasadeva is the full deliberation of the impersonal absolute feature, and it is accepted as the most exalted philosophical exposition in the world. It covers the subject of eternity, and the methods are scholarly. So there cannot be any doubt about the transcendental scholarship of Vyasadeva. So why should we lament? Sridhar Swami has also put it very nicely here. Kim cha yat sanatanam nityam param brahma tatcha tvaya jiknyasitam vicharitam adhitam adhigatam praptam cheti arthaha. Athapi shochasi tat kim artham iti sheshaha. This means, in other words, that you have inquired, you've carefully considered, you've studied, you've understood, and you've actually attained what is that eternal Sanatan Supreme Brahma. So why are you despondent? Nicely stated. Vishwanath Chakravarti, Jiva Goswami doesn't comment, but Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, just as you cannot say that you have not learned enough because you wrote Mahabharata, similarly, neither can you say that the reason for your lamentation is a lack of realization. And this verse makes that very clear. You have investigated, you've made conclusions in the Vedanta Sutras about the eternal Brahman that spreads everywhere in impersonal form. Not only did you inquire about Brahman, jignasatam, but you've understood and realized, adhitam, that Brahman. Sridhar Swami is quoting Sridhar Swami, which we've already heard. So, text number 5. Vyasa uvacha. Now, here comes the answer, halfway through our passage. Aschiva me saravamidam tayoktam tathapi natma paritushyate me tanmulam avyaktam agadha bodham prichama hetvatma bhavatma bhutam. Sri Vyasadeva said, all you have said about me is perfectly correct. He's talking to Narayana. Despite all this, I'm not pacified. Therefore, I question you about the root cause of my dissatisfaction. For you are a man of unlimited knowledge due to your being the offspring of one Brahma, who is self-born, that is without mundane father or mother. Here the significant word is agadha bodham. Agadham bodham means full of unlimited knowledge. The Lord's knowledge, Prabhupada writes elsewhere, is unlimited, and therefore when one cannot touch where it ends, just as one cannot measure the ocean. What is the extent of our intelligence in comparison to the vast expanse of water in the ocean? Prabhupada is writing in the first person here, and this is his purport to Canto 10, chapter 13, text 61. This is just days before he left this world that he wrote this. Keep it in mind. Very interesting. He's writing, what is the extent of our intelligence in comparison to the vast expanse of water in the ocean? On my passage to America, how insignificant the ship was, like a matchbox in the midst of the ocean. Krishna's intelligence resembles the ocean, for one cannot imagine how vast it is. The best course, therefore, is to surrender to Krishna. Don't try to measure Krishna. End quote. So that explains Agadha Bodham, fathomless knowledge, inconceivably deep knowledge. That is the meaning of Agadha Bodham. Purport. This is Prabhupada's purport now. In the material world, everyone is engrossed with the idea of identifying the body or the mind with the self. As such, all knowledge disseminated in the material world is related either with the body or with the mind. And that is the root cause of all despondencies. So first point, anything that you're taught in school, anything that you read in the newspaper, anything generally people around you are telling you, it's all based in the body and the mind. And in this chapter, we will hear Nada say, this non-Krishna katha that we have to hear in this world, that is what agitates our mind further for the same nonsense. To the extent that you're absorbed in seeing, hearing, discussing, touching, tasting, smelling, etc., non-devotional stimuli, to that extent your mind will be agitated for sense gratification. Because anything non-devotional, it has to go to sense gratification. If you are not pleasing Krishna, if you are not in love with Krishna, then you're going to try to please someone else or love someone else or something else. This is the point that Prabhupada is making here. Now, listen to what he says next. This is not always detected, even though one may be the greatest erudite scholar in materialistic knowledge. It is good, therefore, to approach a personality like Datta to solve the root cause of all despondencies. So we have to hear from the right person, and we have to inquire from the right person if we want to root out our own despondencies. You may not always detect the flaws of another person who appears to be very advanced or scholarly or even devoted. It's not always detectable, this is the thing. So one must be sure. I always advise people, anyone, everyone, hear every day from Srila Prabhupada. You can hear from other people, fine, that's okay. But do not listen to other people with the same ears that you listen to Srila Prabhupada with. Because with whatever you hear from Srila Prabhupada, that is as perfect as hearing from Vyasadeva, or from Narad, or from Krishna, for that matter. This is the point. So, why Narad Muni should be approached is explained below. Madhvacharya quotes Padma Purana here, that Hari does things that bewilder the envious. So you can't even, there's a lot of things that we can't understand. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, among other things, that the power derived from Vyasadev's lineage is what has resulted in his being, or Narad Muni's birth is the cause of his great unfathomable knowledge about the Buddha. In other words, he was born from Brahma, and that's why he has such tremendous knowledge. Now we know in his previous life, who was Narad Muni? He was a maidservant's son only. But by associating in the proper way with Bhaktivedantas, he became elevated, such that he became the son of Lord Brahma. Interesting. Text number 6. Savai bhavan veda samasta guhyam upasito yat purusha puranah paravaresho manasaiva vishvam srijat yavatyati gunayada sangaha. This is, again, Vyas still speaking to Narad. My Lord, everything that is mysterious is known to you because you worship the creator and destroyer of the material world and the maintainer of the spiritual world, the original personality of Godhead, who is transcendental to the three modes of material nature. Srila Prabhupada explains in his purport, a person who is 100% engaged in the service of the Lord is the emblem of all knowledge. Such a devotee of the Lord in full perfection of devotional service is also perfect by the qualification of the personality of Godhead. In other words, there's a couple of things to consider here. Number one, you have to be 100% engaged in order to be the emblem of all knowledge. Why is that? Because when we are fully perfect in our devotional service, then our knowledge also becomes perfected by the Lord himself. This is explained in Bhagavad Gita. Tesham satati yuktanam bhajatam priti purvakam dadami buddhiyogam tam yena mam upayanti te. In the 4 Chatushloki Bhagavad Gita, Krishna explains how he gives this knowledge when he sees that we're 100% engaged in his service. When he's pleased, then he gives us the enlightenment. It's not just book learning or just the accumulation of so much impressive data. It is an affair of the heart. The heart has to be purified by the sincere intent to surrender to the Lord. And when the Lord is satisfied by that endeavor, then he enlightens us from within the heart. Okay. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says a few things here. You have described me, this is Vyasdev speaking, you have described me as the son of Parashar with a great lineage, with knowledge of the four Vedas and realization of Brahma. But you are the son of Brahma, the omniscient, Agadha Bodham, and the worshipper of the Supreme Lord. Therefore, you, in all ways, you surpass me. He also adds here the words beginning with Paravaresha, the Lord of cause and effect, further describe that Supreme Lord. The idea is that therefore you know this, the whole secret and the secret behind all things. Samasta guhyam. Sometimes there are things that are mysterious to us. Sometimes there are things that are mysterious to everybody we ask about something. So this is significant, therefore. Narad Muni is a devotee of such caliber that he knows everything that is even mysterious to great devotees. He knows it because he's the son of Brahma. Text 7. Tvam paryatam nardaka ivatri lokim antascharo vayu rivatma sakshi paravare brahmani dhanamato vratayehi snatasya main yunam alam vichakshva. Like the sun, your goodness can travel everywhere in the three worlds, and like the air, you can penetrate the internal region of everyone. As such, you are as good as the all-pervasive supersoul. Please, therefore, find out the deficiency in me, despite my being absorbed in transcendence under disciplinary regulations and vows. We've already described that discipline, regulative principles, vows, any kind of vaidhi, bhakti, we can say in a word, that has practical relevance to our attempts to purify our hearts. If we follow very strictly, we get the results. It is scientific. Here, Srila Prabhupada in his short purport just says, transcendental realization, pious activities, worshiping the deity, charity, mercifulness, nonviolence, and studying the scriptures under strict disciplinary regulations are always helpful. He's giving us a hint of what Vyasa is talking about here. Now, Vyasa, it's ironic though, because Vyasa, in spite of doing these things, is still feeling despondent. So let's move ahead and see what we hear next. Before we move on, actually, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur quotes in his commentary on this verse, Yajnavalkya, from Yajnavalkya Smriti, text 1.8. Ijyachar damahimsa dana swadhyaya karmanam ayam tu paramo dharmo yad yogain atmadarshanam. The supreme dharma by which method one can realize the self consists of worship, proper conduct, control of the senses, non-violence, charity, and study. Does it sound familiar? Now we know where Srila Prabhupada got his comment from. He got it from Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, who concludes here, this is sufficient, and yet still insufficient. Please consider all this. He's talking to his spiritual master. So nodded answers now. Text number 8. Srinad Uvacha. Bhavatanudita prayam yasho bhagavato malam yenaivasao natushyeta manye tad darshanam kilam. Narad said, you have not actually broadcast the sublime and spotless glories of the personality of Godhead. That philosophy which does not satisfy the transcendental senses of the Lord is considered worthless. Purport, Bhaktivedanta purport. The eternal relation of an individual soul with the Supreme Soul is constitutionally one of being the eternal servitor and the eternal master. The Lord has expanded himself as living beings in order to accept loving service from them. And this alone can satisfy both the Lord and the living beings. Such a scholar as Vyasadeva has completed many expansions of the Vedic literatures, ending in the Vedanta philosophy, but none of them have been written directly glorifying the personality of Godhead. Dry philosophical speculations, even on transcendental subject of the absolute, have very little attraction without directly dealing with the glorification of the Lord. Prabhupada continues here. The personality of Godhead is the last word in transcendental realization. The absolute realized as impersonal Brahman or localized supersoul, Paramatma, is less productive of transcendental bliss than the supreme personal realization of his glories. The compiler of the Vedanta Darshan is Vyasadeva himself, yet he is troubled, although he is the author. So what sort of transcendental bliss can be derived by the readers and listeners of Vedanta, which is not explained directly by Vyasadeva, the author? Herein arises the necessity of explaining Vedanta Sutra in the form of Srimad Bhagavatam by the self-same author. We know that Srimad Bhagavatam is actually Vyasadeva's own commentary on Vedanta Sutra. What has Narad Muni told him in effect? Your Vedanta Sutra is too low-key. You've not been explicit enough about the supreme personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. How often do we hear these words throughout Srila Prabhupada's books? Practically speaking, this phrase is found on every single page of anything that Srila Prabhupada wrote. Krishna, the supreme personality of Godhead. Tamal Krishna Goswami went so far as to say that this functions as Srila Prabhupada's Mahavakya. You know, we have the Vedic scholars such as Shankaracharya. He's taken several statements from the Upanishads and elevated them to the status of what he calls great utterances, Mahavakya. One of them is Tattvamasi, or as we said earlier, Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi, ityadi. So for Srila Prabhupada, his Mahavakya is Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead. And Srila Prabhupada said that I have written these books in such a way that no one can possibly misinterpret them in this regard. There is no way that you can read Srila Prabhupada's books and conclude that the absolute truth is impersonal. It is impossible. That is Srila Prabhupada's divine grace. And it is also Lord Krishna's desire. Because Narad Muni, acting on behalf of his guru and Krishna, he's giving this instruction to Vyasadeva right here in these verses. What is that? Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, you've not described much at all, anudita prayam, about the spotless glories of the Lord, the superior position of Bhagavan's forms above all other forms, and the supreme attractiveness of his pastimes and the bhakti. Now Vyas, he might object to this, or he might at least give a reply, although we don't like to talk back to our superiors. But to defend himself, he might say, but I produced the Brahma Mimamsa, the Vedanta Darshan. Therefore, Narad Muni says here, I consider that darshan to be deficient. Kilam, the word is used here, kilam. You're the writer of Vedanta, and if your mind is dissatisfied with this, then how will those who continually study this book be satisfied? You are the proof that Vedanta alone is insufficient. You can't argue with not in. You really can't argue. The logic is inescapable. So let's go on to text 9, see what he says further. Yatha dharmadayashchartha muni varyanu kirtataha. You have glorified dharma and all these other things very nicely. Natatha vasudevasya mahima hyanuvarnati. But you have not repeatedly and so clearly glorified Vasudeva Mahima, the glory of Vasudeva. Okay, purport, Srila Prabhupada writes, the prompt diagnosis of Sri Narad is at once declared. The root cause of the despondency of Vyasadeva was his deliberate avoidance of glorifying the Lord in his various editions of the Puranas, etc. He has certainly, as a matter of course, given description for the glories of the Lord Sri Krishna, but not as many as given to religiosity, economic development, sense gratification, and salvation. These 4 items are by far inferior to engagement in the devotional service of the Lord. Sri Dasdev, as the authorized scholar, knew very well this difference, and still, instead of giving more importance to the better type of engagement, namely devotional service of the Lord, he had more or less improperly used his valuable time. Thus he was despondent. Now, this is a very, very important point. This is where we find, this is probably the strongest, clearest argument or caution, I should say, against what we call in modern parlance bridge preaching, where you present something of the teachings of Srila Prabhupada to an particular audience, but not everything, and certainly not direct glorification of the personality, supreme personality of Godhead Sri Krishna, and the principle of surrendering unto him. We find that many times, even unfortunately to say, it's a new phenomenon. It wasn't there in the old days, but we find that many devotees, they like to avoid certain topics from Srila Prabhupada's books, which is wrong. If we are to act as representatives of Srila Prabhupada, which is the only possible source of our own authority, then we have to say everything that Srila Prabhupada said. And in particular, in this regard, we have to really focus with absolute clarity, the kind of absolute clarity that slaps you in the face from every purport of Srila Prabhupada. We have to very pointedly focus on surrender unto the Supreme Person, Lord Krishna, and his devotees in pure devotion. That's often very difficult to do in a world full of demons, or in a world full of mixed conditional devotion. But if we don't want to smell far worse than weeds, then we have to do that. This is the point. So Nada Muni is making this point now in the next verse, and we'll see what Prabhupada has to say about it. I'm going to continue reading Prabhupada's report. After liberation, which is the last item in the line of performing religiosity, etc., you understand what that means? It means Chaturvidhu Purusharthas, Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Then one is engaged in pure devotional service. This is called the stage of self-realization, or the Brahmabhuta stage. I mentioned that already. After attainment of this Brahmabhuta state, one is satisfied. But satisfaction is the beginning of transcendental bliss. One should progress by attaining neutrality and equality in the relative world. That's the result of spiritual wisdom alone. I mean to say impersonal spiritual wisdom. But, Prabhupada continues, passing this stage of equanimity, one is fixed in the transcendental, loving, service of the Lord. This is the instruction of the personality of Godhead in the Bhagavad Gita. The conclusion is that in order to maintain the status quo of the Brahmabhuta stage, as also to increase the degree of transcendental realization, Narad recommended to Vyasadeva that he, Vyasadeva, should now eagerly and repeatedly describe the path of devotional service. This would cure him from gross despondency. So this principle that the acharyas are explaining, it begins with Madhvacharya, dharmadinam apakaltanena purtihi, navasudeva mahimopi ati kathitasyapi. Same point. You've said so many things about dharma and this and that. That's complete, that's enough. But navasudeva mahimo. You've not said enough about the glory of Vasudeva. So we don't really have time to get into too much, but Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur here says also, how can your mind be satisfied when there's a lack of regard for that which should have been given the most regard? Very well put. He also quotes from Padma Purana. Liberation is the highest goal in visiting other holy places, but devotion to the Lord, prayed for by the liberated soul, can be obtained at Mathura. It implies clearly that beyond liberation is bhakti. And then he quotes Brahmabhuta Prasannatma, which we've already heard at least twice today. So then he says, Anuvarnita, you have described all these things repeatedly, all the Trigunya things, and even liberation. You must do so because it is said that the meaning of scriptures is revealed by repetition. But your mind will be satisfied only when you describe very clearly with repetition the glories of the Lord. You'll notice if you're looking at the verse, two words are used. One of them is Anuvarnitaha. That means to have described something following the authorities. And the other one is Anukirtita. That is to repeatedly describe something. So you have your preaching is authorized. You're not saying anything that's not correct, but you're not really emphasizing Hari Bhakti enough. This is the point. And it's clear by now. So finally, we'll end now with the famous verse. Na yad vachaschitra padam harer yusho jagat pavitram prakaranita karhachita tadvayasam tirthamushanti manasa na yatra hansa niramantyushikshayaha. Those words which do not describe the glories of the Lord, who alone can sanctify the atmosphere of the whole universe, are considered by saintly persons to be likened to a place of pilgrimage for crows. Since the all-perfect persons are inhabitants of the transcendental abode, they do not derive any pleasure there. Purport, very important purport by Prabhupada. And then we'll end. Crows and swans are not birds of the same feather. Because of their different mental attitudes, the fruitive workers or passionate men are compared to the crows, whereas the all-perfect saintly persons are compared to the swans. The crows take pleasure in a place where garbage is thrown out, just as the passionate fruitive workers take pleasure in wine and woman in places for gross sense pleasure, such as Disney World, or Las Vegas, or all Indians in America, without fail, they visit Niagara Falls. Or some people end up in Dubai or Kuwait or other places. So those who are actually seeking pleasure there, and those who believe that there is pleasure to be found in these places, they're like crows. because they're in the lower modes of nature, passion and ignorance. By contrast, Srila Prabhupada compares, rather Nada Muni compares, the swans to be like the saintly persons, perfect saintly persons. Padamahamsa, we say. Hamsa, swans. Swans, they like to clean places, very pure sattvic environment, where there are lotus flowers, clean water, so much greenery. It's a very different mentality. Where do we see crows mostly? Where do crows like to hang out? Garbage pile. That's where they're at. There are people like this also. All the pseudo-equality put aside, nobody actually believes that everyone is equal. There's no equality in this material world. Some people are just better than others, materially, in terms of material conditioning only. Spiritually, everybody is same status. But it matters. We've discussed in the beginning, our external affairs and external engagements, they impact our internal consciousness. And so it matters when we're conditioned souls. Therefore, we have the principle, Bhadram Karnebhi Shruniyama Devaha Ityadi. Should see auspicious things, hear auspicious things, speak auspicious things, live in auspicious places. Vanam tu satviko vaso, brahmo rajasa uchyate, tamasam yudasadanam, manniketam tu nirganam. Krishna tells Uddhava in Canto 11. The natural environment, forests and country land, that is sattvic. Cities are rajasic, and sinful places such as Las Vegas and gambling casinos and houses of ill repute of all sorts, these are tamasic places. But the temple of Krishna, or the Dham of Krishna, Mandiketam tu Nirganam, Krishna says, these places are transcendental, even beyond Sattva-guna. This goes back to the previous statement Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur quoted from Padma Purana. Ordinary holy place, like say Tiruchendur, places known for demigods, they may be in Sattva-guna, they may elevate us, but they're no comparison to Sri Dham Vrindavan, or Dwarka Dham, or Ayodhya Puri, where the Lord has performed his own pastimes. Okay. Nature has influenced different species of life with different mentalities, and it is not possible to bring them up to the same rank and file. This is Prabhupada's statement. An inescapably clear statement of hard and fast duality, a notion that is despised by both Mayavadis and mundane cheaters as well. They like to see everything as one, but it isn't. Similarly, there are different kinds of literature for different types of men with different mentality. Mostly the market literatures which attract men of the prose category are literatures containing refused remnants of sensuous topics. They are generally known as mundane talks in relation with a gross body and subtle mind. We've already described that. They're full of subject matter described in decorative language, full of mundane similes and metaphorical arrangements, yet with all that, they do not glorify the Lord. Therefore, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, one of his poems, he's actually said it directly, Yadi kavyaraso nahi kavyarasa. If not glorifying the Lord of Godruma's forest bowers, Lord Gaurachandra, then all this very high poetry and wonderful literature, it's not real literature. It's not really literature. Prabhupada says, such poetry and prose on any subject matter is considered to be the decoration of a dead body. Spiritually advanced men who are compared to swans do not take pleasure in such dead literature, which is the source of pleasure only for those who are spiritually dead. Why? Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Adi antavanta kaunteya nateshu ramate buddha. Persons who are smart do not bother trying to find pleasure in things that have a beginning and an end. They only seek pleasure in the realm of eternity. Therefore, swan-like spiritually advanced men have nothing to do with mundane literatures. This completely forbids fruitive activities for gross bodily sense gratification or subtle speculation of the material egoistic mind. You can't get anywhere with just karma and gyan. We don't even have the adhikar for karma and gyan, frankly speaking, because it's Kali Yuga. You do not follow pious regulations. Admit it. You can't follow anything. None of us can. Similarly, what adhikar do we have for mental speculation on the absolute truth when our minds are full of the fog of false ego? So all these persons who are absorbed in karma and gyan, they're like so many dancing dolls in the hands of the material energy. Wherever she tells them to go, they just move like that. We've already described that. So they take pleasure, the non-devotees, that is to say, they take pleasure in a place where rejected subject matters are thrown. According to Swami Sridhar, this is the pleasure of the prostitute hunters. But literatures which describe the glories of the Lord are enjoyed by the Paramahamsas, who have grasped the essence of human activities. The essence of human activities is pure devotional service, Vasudeva Mahima, Varnana. So I think we can stop here. Just one thing I'll add quickly from Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary. Even poetic works should be condemned if they're devoid of glorification of Vasudeva. A work whose verses do not proclaim the glories of the Lord, which purify even the whole world composed of speakers and listeners, what to speak of the author, is actually like a dead body. It's very impure, and without describing the glories of the Lord, which are like life itself. We live on the topics of Krishna. Matchitta madgata prana bodhayanta parasparam katayantashtama nityam tushyanti charamanticha. Again, from the same section of Bhagavad Gita, Chatushloki Bhagavad Gita. Devotees' lives depend on this process of enlightening one another and conversing about Krishna directly, and idealizing the principle of pure devotion and surrender, full surrender. We have to discuss these things directly, and we have to propagate these things directly also. Otherwise, we become compromised, and when you're in a compromised position, you're in a vulnerable position, and then you gradually get sucked into Maya. This is the problem. You get pulled into the Ushanti, the place of pilgrimage for crows. It's like a hole filled with various leftover foodstuffs that nobody wants to eat. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says. It's only desired, these mundane happiness is only desired by persons filled with lust, etc., who are like crows. Okay. There's a lot more commentary here, but I think in the interest of saving time, we should probably stop here. And I'll just ask if there are any questions or any comments. Anybody has anything to say or inquire about this?
Thank you so much, Prabhu. In the limited time, you have given so much, Prabhu, and so many takeaway and so many learnings from this verses, Prabhuji. Thank you so much, Prabhu. Prabhu, with permission, Prabhu, we'll take some question. So, if devotee, they have any question, please raise your hand so that we can unmute you. Okay, Chod Krishna Prabhu and Yashomadan Prabhu. One by one, you can unmute yourself, please. Yashomadan Prabhu, please, Prabhuji, go ahead.
Hare Krishna, Dandot Pranam Prabhuji, please accept my humble obeisances. I have two questions, but as the time is limited, I will ask one first. So, Prabhu, in your verse number 9, you mentioned about the bridge preaching. So, Prabhu, like now in our society, we have some kirtaniyas. They are very famous, and sometimes we get attracted by that. Then there are motivational speakers. So sometimes we attract from them. Then there are even Matajis who are leading the kirtans in a big festivals or like that gatherings, or the woman speakers and like that all, Prabhu. So as you mentioned, if we are not following Srila Prabhupada, then it is like how we can accept ourselves we are follower of Srila Prabhupada, but there are so many deviations, and as we have not that stage of where we can differentiate, and that also sometimes we get attracted by this all. So how we can understand this, Prabhu? Just can you just tell something about this, Prabhuji?
Okay, well, it's a big question, or rather it's a big arena full of questions that you've raised. I think to cover all of those in the short time that we have, probably the best advice I will give is that we have to absorb ourselves, as I mentioned already briefly, in hearing daily from Srila Prabhupada directly. And in particular, certainly we have to read his books every day, his books. If you want to see how Srila Prabhupada applied these teachings in preaching Krishna consciousness, then another very helpful source would be the recorded conversations that he had with devotees. And many of his letters have been published, correspondence with various disciples and also others. The only caveat that I would have to add to that is that, those instructions are very context specific. They are directed to a particular time, place, and circumstance or audience. And they may or may not apply in our present context of concern. So the books have to be the main focus. And it's really not easy to pull the wool over the eyes of somebody who is deeply absorbed in hearing from Srila Prabhupada every day. So this is probably the main problem in our society. Maybe 6-7 years ago, I think it was 2014, they did a survey at the ISKCON Leadership Sangha in Mayapur, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it was later than that, but they took a survey to see how many of ISKCON's leaders, that means the managers, senior people in ISKCON, how many of them have read or are reading regularly all of Srila Prabhupada's books. It turns out that less than 25% have read or are reading all of Prabhupada's books every day. And these are the leaders. So what are they teaching us? It's something to think about. At least it's very telling as to what our major focus should be on alleviating all the problems, because Krishna swadhamo bhagate dharma jnana visaha kalau nashta trishanesha purana arko dhunodita. Srila Prabhupada said, books are the basis. His books are the basis, not somebody else's books. They're the basis because Shastriyonitva, everything truly spiritual and everything in Krishna consciousness is ultimately coming from Srimad Bhagavatam. If we're not in touch with Srimad Bhagavatam, if we've not memorized Srimad Bhagavatam, then we're not thinking Srimad Bhagavatam, and therefore we're not acting Srimad Bhagavatam, and we certainly won't be able to speak Srimad Bhagavatam. So, Tat Shrinu, this is the instruction that practically I would say Prabhupada's favorite verse was speaking from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 7, text 1. Krishna says, if you want to be fully Krishna conscious, free from doubt, then just hear. It's not so easy thing to hear. Everybody wants to talk. That is Ritvik disease. Definition of Ritvik, He wants to talk more than he wants to listen. So, we have to hear, and we have to learn how to hear. And Prabhupada told us how to hear. In the very beginning of the class, I mentioned that sequence mentioned in the Chandogya Upanishad, which Prabhupada reiterates in his own Bhagavad Gita commentary on chapter 3, text 11. You have to be pure in your habits. When your habits are pure, your mind will become pure. When your mind is pure, your intelligence becomes sharp. Memory is awakened. And that's a hard thing to do because it requires sense control. All the smritis, injunctions, vidhis in the Shastras, they all have this nature. They check us, they restrain us, and we don't like that because we're rebellious. Srila Prabhupada saw this, and within the last, say, 4 or so years that he was with us, he really started to emphasize the necessity for ISKCON devotees to try to apply Varnashram principles to our society, amongst ourselves, not for the outside people, for us. And there's the reason that is valuable is because it affects this process of ahara shuddhi, ahara shuddho, sattva shuddhi, sattva shuddho, dhruvasmriti, ityadi, that we mentioned. It purifies our existence, I mean to say. Sattva samshuddhi. This is among the first things that Krishna mentioned to Arjuna when Krishna himself is defining knowledge. Abhayam sattva samshuddhi. Second thing. First thing, don't be afraid. Because we're afraid to hear anything. That's described in chapter 4, text 10. We get threatened by too much personality, too much bhakti. So we have to hear from Srila Prabhupada, and we have to be very strict about that. Otherwise, we will be confused. We will definitely be confused. And then the standards of everything follows only from that. Really, I'm not even addressing the effects. I'm only addressing the cause here. All these things that your social concerns and theological fidelity and other things that you've mentioned, these are like the wake of a ship that has already sailed on long ago. They've been set in motion by somebody's neglect years ago. So, we can't really water each and every leaf so much, but if we water the root of the tree, then the problem will be solved. So this is the root. You have to water the root. And that watering process is hearing and chanting, according to Chaitanya Charitamrita. And particularly hearing from Srila Prabhupada. As I said, his letters and his conversations, they can be extremely helpful in practical circumstances. For example, now we see it's a very popular practice to have kirtan programs. In these kirtans, it's only kirtan. There's no philosophy. Because the younger people in particular, many of them, they don't even want to hear philosophy. And many times they cannot hear philosophy. They're so thoroughly indoctrinated by their Marxist education that any talk that threatens those principles and they just turn off. So that is, again, it's just a symptom of a deeper disease. But my point is this, that you can ask Shrita Kirti Prabhu or any of Prabhupada's former servants. Whenever Srila Prabhupada had an ISKCON program, there were always 4 components. Number 1 is Hare Krishna Kirtan, not Shiva Kirtan and whatever other kirtans, unrecognizable tunes and things like that. Hare Krishna Kirtan. Bhagavad Gita, from Bhagavad Gita as it is, I mean to say, Krishna Prasadam. Don't underestimate the power of Prasadam. And books for sale. Prabhupada always wanted to have a book table there. Any ISKCON program should have these 4 components. So this kirtan for entertainment or infotainment sort of kathas that we get also, and other kinds of newfangled things that don't follow Prabhupada standards, we should be very careful about them, but we should know why also. we should recognize that Prabhupada did things a certain way. He did not want a certain effect. At some point, both in London and around 1969, and also in the United States, a year or so later, or around the same time perhaps, devotees used to go out to various programs in dubious venues, like they would go to nightclubs in Europe when people were all engaged in sinful act, and they would do kirtan there as if they were entertainers. In the beginning, Prabhupada tolerated it for some time just to give us publicity. But after a while, Prabhupada checked that program because it was not sustainable for Krishna consciousness in the long run. You know, the many things that Prabhupada was willing to do as a compromise for time, place, and circumstance, but he did not want them to be permanently established as regular standards for our society. So practically the only way to really know that is to judge by what he did himself and what he instructed himself. And those instructions may not be in his books because his books are not that practical all the time. So that's the value of studying Prabhupada's books and his letters. But really the principles and the real examples are to be found in the Shastras. Just like we've mentioned Mahabharata, here Narad Muni confirms, if you're interested in things regarding dharma, Adi, then Mahabharata is your resource. Ramayana, same. Those books are there. But to understand where this is all going, that you're only going to get it from Srimad Bhagavatam. So we have to hear from Srila Prabhupada, and we have to hear from all of Prabhupada's books. We have to read all of his books. Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita, Nectar of Devotion, Ishopanishad. These four, Prabhupada particularly stressed. He insisted, rather. I heard one lecture in which Prabhupada said, to read 2 hours a day, that is the austerity which is ideal. But at least we should read every day. And then we will not be swayed too much here and there. And, you know, as far as for people who want to water things down or change things or, you know, mix it with various fruitive activities and philosophical spectrum, what can you do? You can only fly your own plane, but you can preach Krishna consciousness, depending on what you've been hearing from Srila Prabhupada. That is the need. I hope that's sufficient. It's a huge topic, but you know, I think it's kind of pretty close to hitting the essence of the problem. We're not connected with Prabhupada enough. The way to connect with Prabhupada after his physical departure is to connect with his Vani. He left so much Vani for us, specifically for that reason. Just so that those of us who never had his association, or for those of us who have lost his association, in either case, he's still available to us, but we have to know where he said his book. Is that okay, Prabhuji?
Yes, thank you so much, Prabhuji. Thank you, Prabhuji. We are indebted of you, Prabhu, for such a nice way you explained, Prabhu. So thank you so much, Prabhu.
Okay, you are Yashamati Nandan, or you are Ramchar?
Yasomati Nanandas, Prabhuji.
Okay, so Ramchar Prabhu also had a question if he's still here.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji, Dandavat Pranams. Prabhuji, thank you very much for a wonderful class full of instructions. In Shloka 5, Prabhuji, we discussed Srila Prabhupada's purport about material education being the root cause of all despondencies. Prabhuji, in our daily lives, we see that since a child is born, it starts play school and then schooling, college and university, and even in work life, it's full of material education, and for earning a living, that has become a necessity. And then further, it doesn't stop there, but after that also in work life, there are so many seminars, so many further courses to be done. So that ultimately gives a feeling of despondency, but not able to find a solution out of it, Prabhuji. So please enlighten on how this can be dealt with.
Maybe you can repeat your question a little louder. I didn't get it.
So, Prabhupada purport mentions about material education being root cause of all despondencies.
Yes, I got that.
And throughout since childhood till a person retires, he is bombarded with material education, and that comes from earning a living in school, colleges, universities, even in offices. There are so many seminars, courses attend all the time. So, Prabhuji, then how to find a solution out of it, because that really leads to despondencies. So what can be done practically?
Revolution. How do you like that? Radical revolution. You ready?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. Most of us aren't. Actually, what needs to be done is what is the ideal that is found in Srila Prabhupada's books, which is simple agrarian living based on God. But nobody's ready to do that, my friends. That's the real problem. We all want to compromise to some degree. Household life in particular means you have to compromise. It's not possible to raise kids or to feed kids unless you're compromised to some degree, and this is what's eating at you. So, you have to, as Prabhupada, he used to quote one Bengali proverb, you have to be able to catch a fish without getting wet. And that's a tall order. So what is the best way to do that? You have to inoculate yourself. Now we're living in the age of inoculation. So you have to take sufficient vaccine. That vaccine is morning program, Srila Prabhupada's books, 16 rounds of chanting Hare Krishna mantra with attention, association with devotees, Krishna Prasadam, the whole process of Krishna consciousness, but especially morning program and ideally evening program. And if you're working for a slave driver who doesn't give you sufficient time off that you can do that, then you're working for the wrong slave driver. What can be said? In Texas, once I was giving a lecture and somebody said, one Gujarati man, he owned a convenience store. That is to say, they sell so many things, but they also sell liquor. And so he was hearing about our principles and he said, is this going to be a problem? And I said, yes, it is going to be a problem because you're going to get reaction for all the things that you're doing, simple things. But, you have to do what you have to do. I advise him, look for some line of work that doesn't entangle you so much. But generally, this is what Prabhupada would advise. Mm-hmm. Krishna is always going to take care of a devotee who is sincerely trying to fulfill his mission in this world. We have to have that faith. And anyway, jo kuch bhi, lalake par likha hua hai, that's going to happen. So it's already written what you're going to get in life. And you should not think that the source of your paycheck is the same as the source of your maintenance. Prabhupada actually says this in Chaitanya Charitamrita. This is why we have spiritual masters, because they can give us very practical, detailed guidance, for our own particular personal circumstance. It does get very specific and practical and personal. So that's why we have spiritual masters. They can help.
Video on it.
Hare Krishna, can you hear me, please?
Yes, Prabhu. Yes, Prabhu.
Yes.
Okay, so the first thing is to recognize that we're not living in an ideal circumstance, and that circumstance therefore should be changed. It's not going to change of its own accord. We have to change it. That's the first thing. We have high ideals. We may not meet our ideals, but we should know what they are. Otherwise, we'll get bewildered and distracted. Then having I want to say assimilated, or having recognized what the ideal is, then we can strategize. Then we can work with the practical considerations, how to organize our lives in such a way that we get a little closer to those ideals every day. That is what has to be done. And it's really hard to do that as a householder. I know this. From personal experience, I know it. But this is the austerity. If we are to represent Srila Prabhupada in this world, then we have to do what Prabhupada would do. Look at Prabhupada's household life and see how he managed his affairs. This is what we have to do. We should not remain in a compromised position forever. We will not remain. Don't get caught at the time of death with your work unfinished, because otherwise you will finish it in another life, in this world. Tamal Krishna Goswami said, I was hearing a lecture the other day, Krishna is constantly testing our determination to surrender unto him. And if we don't face those challenges, if we don't take those tests, and if we don't pass those tests, then we simply have to come back and take them again. It's like school. It's just like that. If you fail the test and they flunk you and you come back next year, all your friends are in the class ahead of you now. So this is life. It's not that we're the enjoyers here. We are servants and we have to struggle. Kinkara. In Sanskrit, the word for servant means Kim Karishyamaha. What shall I do, sir? That's why he's called Kinkara. So we have to hustle and we have to work and we have to struggle and we have to somehow, we have to move up, and it's not easy. It's like swimming against the stream, swimming upstream. But in order to retain some inspiration for that struggle, we have to know what is our ideal, and we have to be receiving inspiration from the pages of the Srimad Bhagavatam. That is Prabhupada's divine grace. That is his main divine grace, I want to say. The instructions that he's given us. Otherwise, why do we worship him? Okay? Is that sufficient?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I haven't gone into a great deal of detail because it's not really possible, but at least you know where to go to find it. All right.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you, sir.
Radhe Radhe.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji, Dandavat Pranam, all close to Srila Prabhupada. My question was related to what we read, that our identity with body and mind cannot be easily detected. So, so even with introspection, how do we understand that? So
okay, I'll read it again. All knowledge disseminated in the material world is related either with the body or with the mind, and that is the root cause of all despondencies. But we don't easily detect this. In other words, we hear things that sound good. This is a very good question because it directly relates to the previous question, in which I was emphasizing the need to hear repeatedly, anuvarnita, and describe only what Prabhupada says. All knowledge in the material world, all communication, I mean to say, in the material world, it's all contaminated with the notions of, faith in the body and faith in the mind. But we can't see that all the time. And that's why we get distracted, because somebody will present something to you, even they present it to you as Krishna consciousness. And if your intelligence has not been sharpened by the process of hearing daily from Srila Prabhupada, then your intelligence may be bewildered. I'm not even addressing the need to elevate our faith. It's understood that our faith is already contaminated because we're conditioned souls. But at least if we can purify our intelligence, then intellectually we can recognize, wait a minute, this sounds off. There are some red flags here. You see? So again, it's the same thing. We have to be so steeped in Srila Prabhupada's teachings. We have to be so much aware of his personal example. We have to try to follow the standards that he established in ISKCON, and then we'll be solidly situated. Otherwise, it will not be easy to detect it when something is presented that looks like it's okay, but it's not. Or something is presented that, is identified even not only with the body, but just even with the mind, some subtle, twisting and twangling of Krishna consciousness philosophy. It happens all the time. It happens all the time. So we have to be very sharp. And it's described like a sharpened sword in the 7th canto. You have to sharpen the sword against the stone of the process of hearing from the bona fide spiritual master. And if we do that every day, then our intelligence is razor sharp and nobody can rip us off. Nobody can bewilder us. Nobody's going to disturb our faith. Nobody's going to confuse us. Either in the name of devotional service or what to speak of outside. Is that okay?
Yes.
It's subtle. This is the point. Contamination can be extremely subtle and therefore imperceptible to us. So as we purify our existence, as with that whole chain of requirements that we went through in the beginning, as our sattva becomes samshuddha, I should say, then we begin to see all this very clearly, and it makes it a lot easier. It does get easier. In the beginning, it's really overwhelming because we don't even have the gyan, what to speak of the vigyan. Vigyan comes as a result of applying the principles, but we're not even sure what the principles are, and at the same time we're trying to apply them. So it's very trying. It can be hard, yeah. So, but we get all support, we get all encouragement, we get all strengthening and rejuvenation and support, every kind of support we get from association with more advanced devotees. Therefore it said, sadhu sangha sarva shastra koi lava matra sadhu sangha sarva siddhi. Even a little bit, if that devotee is pure, we can be elevated like that. Beyond so many years of struggle, we can be elevated in an instant by taking advantage of a good devotee's association. Theek rahega?
Thank you, Prabhuji.
Okay.
Thank you, Prabhu. Prabhu, if you have a time, Prabhu, can we take one or two more questions, Prabhu?
Yes, certainly.
Okay. Prabhu, in the verse number 4, when Narmani is saying that you have fully deliberated realized the subject of impersonal Brahman, why should you be despondent in spite of all this? So this is a kind of comment he's making, or how can a person be completely satisfied if he has realized the impersonal Brahman?
Yeah, it does seem a little bit tongue-in-cheek, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially since Narad Muni also calls him Prabhu. You kind of get the sense that he's being a little sarcastic. So, and I think that Prabhupada's purports, they kind of, they lend credence to that interpretation because, in one sense, Prabhupada has told us, Narad Muni is actually pleased with the fact that Vyasdeva is, at least conscious enough to recognize that he's insufficient, but also sincere enough to present the matter to his spiritual master and submissive enough to surrender to whatever his guru says. That has pleased Narad Muni. But the fact that there is a problem, and the problem itself, Narad Muni wants to clearly suggest, without saying too strongly, that it's not right. I think he's definitely doing that on purpose. Is that answering your question?
Yeah. Thank you, Prabhuji. And Prabhu, the verse number 10, Prabhu,
Yes.
so beautifully described, Prabhuji, that how, and we read this, devoid of the Lord glories and his scriptures, that becomes like a pilgrimage place of crows. And we also hear the offenses against the holy name, that we should not blaspheme the Vedic literature or the literature in the persons of Vedas.
Yeah.
So what should be our reactions when we hear such things about the glories of some scriptures by someone who is following it? How we should react in that circumstance?
let me give you a couple of examples. For example, sometimes people come up with Devi Bhagavata. And it's true, Devi Bhagavata is pretty old from an empirical perspective as far as scholarship goes. You know, it seems to be, I mean, Jiva Goswami refers to Devi Bhagavata in his Sandarbhas even. He at least recognizes that it existed back then. So, you know, it's not something that was just invented out of whole cloth. But at the same time, judging from the standards of Srimad Bhagavatam, you know, it's not on a par with Srimad Bhagavatam at all. And in fact, none of the other literatures, all of them are trivargic. As in text 4, it was described already that, you know, hearing from various scriptures will involve things that are catering to the body and the mind. And this is the nature of virtually all of the things that Vyasadeva had written before writing the Vedanta Sutra. The problem with Vedanta Sutra, the only problem with Vedanta Sutra is that it's impersonal. So spiritual, but not impersonal. I'm spiritual, but not personal, I mean to say. So Srimad Bhagavatam is really the zenith of scriptures. And that said, we should not denigrate other scriptures. Here's another example. Sometimes even in ISKCON, you find devotees who virtually, you know, denigrate Manusmriti, for example. Throughout Srila Prabhupada's purports, those who read those purports know very well, Srila Prabhupada nowhere does Prabhupada discourage the standards that are mentioned in that scripture. Everywhere Srila Prabhupada upholds the traditional assertion that this is the law book for human society. People should respect the teachings of such authorities as Yajnavalkya. We've quoted Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur quoting him, for example, in his commentary on today's passage, or Manusmriti and others. These are also Vedic literatures, and it is an offense against the holy name to blaspheme. Shruti Smriti Ninda. It is an offense. Particularly, I find this offense is more prominent in the Western world. For some reason, people have this idea that you know, they're above all the instructions of other scriptures. But you know, while we recognize the sacrosanct status of Srimad Bhagavatam and the entirely transcendental status of Srimad Bhagavatam, we should not thereby minimize the utility of the teachings that are found, or at least explained more widely, in other scriptures. Srimad Bhagavatam